The wind's howl was a razor's edge against the weathered siding of the farmhouse, but Ethan Miller barely registered its bite. A deeper chill had settled in his bones years ago, a bitterness that had long since frozen his spirit solid. His eyes, which once held the bright promise of a summer cornfield, were now the flat, lifeless gray of the snow-heavy sky blanketing his fallow land. The final letter from the bank, its paper thin and unforgiving, felt like a burning coal in his pocket. The stark red stamp declared, "Final notice," a cruel redundancy for a man who needed no more reminders of the wreckage his life had become. Ethan cinched his frayed coat tighter, his boots sinking into the fast-collecting drifts, each step a testament to his weariness. The fence line was a crooked smile of broken posts, another task on a never-ending list of things that were beyond repair on his property. He could have stayed inside, but the crushing loneliness of the silent house was more suffocating than the wind's icy grip. That's when he heard it, a sound so alien in this desolate expanse that he almost dismissed it as a trick of the wind. A child's muffled cry. "Help!" A small, trembling voice cut through the gale. "Somebody, please!" Ethan froze, his heart giving a painful lurch against his ribs. The cry came again, this time joined by another. Two of them. "Lily, I'm scared." "Shh, Grace, it'll be okay." Following the thin sounds, Ethan discovered them, two girls huddled under the heavy boughs of a snow-laden pine. Identical twins, no older than 5. Their pink coats, obviously expensive, were soaked through, and their small faces were chapped raw by the cold, with tears freezing on their cheeks. "What the hell?" Ethan grumbled, his voice a rusty rasp from disuse, which only made the girls cling to one another more fiercely. "Please, sir," said the one who seemed to be Lily, protectively shielding her sister. "We got lost." Ethan scraped a rough hand across his beard, the weight of a decision settling upon him. The situation felt wrong. 2 well-dressed little girls alone on his land during a blizzard. But to leave them here was to condemn them. "Come with me," he said at last, his tone harsher than he'd intended. "My house isn't far." The girls hesitated, a shared look of fear and hope flashing between their identical faces. "You'd rather freeze out here?" Ethan asked impatiently, a part of him, the part that hadn't died yet, regretting his sharpness as he saw them flinch. Lily was the first to her feet, pulling Grace up with her. "Thank you, sir." The trek back to the Miller farm was a silent ordeal, punctuated only by the chattering of the girls' teeth. Ethan forced himself not to watch their clumsy progress, the way their flimsy boots sank into the deep drifts, or the quiet, hitching sobs that escaped Grace's lips from time to time. When they finally reached it, the house seemed even more dilapidated through his own eyes. The porch floorboards groaned a protest under their combined weight, and peeling paint exposed the rotting wood beneath. He couldn't read the twins' expressions as they stepped inside. It was either fear of the place or profound relief from the biting cold. "Sit near the fire," he ordered, gesturing to the nearly dead hearth. While the girls obeyed, Ethan rummaged for the only clean blankets he owned. "You need to take off those wet clothes," he said, holding out the wool blankets. The twins exchanged that silent, telepathic look again. "You can change behind the couch. I'll make something hot for you to drink." In the kitchen, he found a forgotten canister of cocoa powder pushed to the back of a cabinet. As he heated the milk, which miraculously hadn't soured, he could hear their hushed whispers. "He seems angry," Grace murmured. "But he helped us," Lily replied. "Like Dad said, not all good people seem good on the outside." Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest at that. It had been an eternity since anyone had been in his kitchen, since he'd had to consider anyone but himself. The mugs clinked unsteadily in his hands as he returned to the living room. The girls were now swaddled in the blankets, their blonde hair still dark and damp from the snow. They took the cups with shy thank yous, blowing on the hot chocolate with perfectly mirrored caution. "So," Ethan began, sinking into his worn-out armchair, "care to tell me how you ended up on my land in the middle of a blizzard?" Lily bit her lip, glancing at her sister before speaking. We were playing explorers, and we got lost." "Explorers," Ethan repeated, his disbelief plain. "In this weather, alone?" "Ashley," Grace started, but Lily jabbed her with an elbow. "Who's Ashley?" Ethan pressed, catching the exchange. "No one," Lily said, far too quickly. "We just got lost, that's all." Ethan studied their identical faces. The story felt rehearsed, lines memorized for a play. But why would two 5-year-olds need such a cover story? A flash of memory struck him. His own daughter, at that same age, spinning tales to hide some minor mischief. The familiar ache constricted his chest, and he stood up abruptly, startling them. "It's late," he said, his voice gruff. "You can sleep in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow morning we'll sort this out." "Are you calling the police?" Grace asked, her eyes wide with a specific kind of fear. Ethan hesitated. He should, of course, it was the responsible thing to do, but something in their pleading expressions made him relent. "Not tonight. Right now, you need to rest." The guest room was cold and smelled of dust, but it was a world away from the frozen forest. He found a set of clean sheets in the back of a linen closet and made the bed as the twins watched from the doorway, still cocooned in their blankets. "Try to sleep," he said, his hand hovering uncertainly over the light switch. If you need anything, I'll be in the living room." "Good night, sir," they answered in unison, already burrowing together in the bed that dwarfed their small frames. Ethan closed the door slowly, fighting the tightness in his throat at the sight of two blonde heads side by side on the pillow. So much like. No, he couldn't go there. Back in the living room, Ethan collapsed into his armchair, his gaze fixed on the dying embers. The wind still howled, but the house felt different, less empty, less dead. He should be worried about the girls' transparent lies, about the mystery of their appearance. He should be figuring out how to find their parents and rid himself of this sudden, unwanted burden. Yet all he could think about was the faint sound of their breathing from down the hall, the weight of the empty cocoa mugs, the way Grace had offered a small, timid smile. "Just until tomorrow," Ethan muttered to himself, trying to ignore the way his own voice sounded less bitter. "Just until the storm passes." But as he drifted off to sleep in his chair, the last warmth fading from the hearth, he couldn't shake the traitorous thought that for the first time in years he didn't feel utterly alone. In the guest room, the twins whispered beneath the covers. "Do you think he'll tell anyone?" Grace asked, her voice tiny in the dark. "No," Lily answered with a certainty that belied her age. "He seems sad, like Dad was after Mom left. Sad people understand other sad people." Grace snuggled closer to her sister. "He made us hot chocolate." "Yeah," Lily smiled in the darkness. "Maybe he's not so scary after all." The girls finally slept, their fingers intertwined, while outside the snow fell relentlessly, erasing their tracks in the forest as if they had never been there at all. Ethan woke with a jolt hours later, his neck stiff from the armchair. For a disoriented moment, he felt a change in the house's deep silence. Then he heard it, the soft patter of small feet in the hall, a whisper, a stifled giggle. His first instinct was a surge of irritation at the disturbance of his solitude. But then the memories of the previous night flooded back, and with them that strange sensation in his chest, somewhere between annoyance and something he refused to name. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep, startling the twins as they peeked around the living room doorframe. "Sorry," Lily said, stepping into the room with Grace clutching the back of her pajamas. "It's just we always wake up early." Ethan glanced at the old clock on the mantel. 5:30 a.m. It was still pitch black outside, but the storm had broken, leaving the heavy silence of fresh fallen snow. "Are you hungry?" he heard himself ask, the question surprising even him. The girls nodded vigorously. In the kitchen, Ethan managed to find eggs and some bread that hadn't yet succumbed to mold. It wasn't much, but the girl's eyes lit up as if it were a royal feast. "Do you always wake up this early?" he asked as he cracked the eggs, trying to keep his tone neutral. "In our old house we did," Grace said before Lily could shush her, "to watch the sunrise with Mom." Ethan nearly dropped the skillet. "Your old house?" "Grace," Lily admonished her sister with a look far too mature for her years. "Sorry," Grace mumbled, her eyes dropping to her small hands. Ethan served the eggs without another word, his mind racing. An old house, a mother in the past tense, more pieces to a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to assemble. The girls ate with a hunger that made him wonder when they'd last had a real meal. He watched them divide the toast into perfectly equal halves, sharing without a word in a practiced, familiar ritual. "Do you live here alone?" Lily asked after a while, her curious gaze sweeping over the cluttered kitchen. "Yes," Ethan replied curtly, hoping the tone would shut down further inquiry. But Grace, seemingly emboldened by the breakfast, pressed on. "Isn't it sad?" The question struck Ethan like a physical blow. He suddenly saw his kitchen through their eyes. Dirty dishes in the sink, water stains on the walls, empty cupboards, a tangible loneliness clinging to the shadows. Sometimes, he admitted, his voice softer than he'd intended. "But you get used to it." No one should get used to being alone, Lily stated with that odd, childish wisdom she sometimes displayed. Ethan rose abruptly, gathering the plates. "You need to tell me where you live. Your parents must be worried." The silence that met his question was thick with resistance. When he turned back from the sink, he saw the twins exchanging that silent, loaded look again. Lily started, but was cut off by a sound that made all three of them freeze, the sound of approaching car engines. Ethan rushed to the kitchen window. 3 black SUVs were cutting a path across his property, their powerful headlights slicing through the pre-dawn gloom. "It's them," he heard Grace whisper, pure terror in her voice. "Who?" Ethan demanded, turning to the girls, but they were already gone, fleeing the kitchen. He found them crammed into the guest room closet, clinging to one another. "Please," Lily begged, tears welling in her eyes, "don't let them take us." Ethan's world spun. What kind of mess had he stumbled into? Who were the people in those vehicles? Police? Kidnappers? The sound of car doors slamming shut echoed outside, followed by men's voices calling their names. Lily. Grace. The girls burrowed deeper into the closet, and something inside Ethan, an instinct he thought had died with his family, roared to life, a fierce primal urge to protect. "Stay here," he whispered, closing the closet doors. "Don't make a sound." Heavy footsteps were now on his porch. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic hammering in his chest. He was about to find out exactly what kind of story he had walked into, and to his own astonishment, he realized he didn't much care about the consequences, not as long as he could shield the 2 little girls who, in less than a day, had begun to thaw the ice around his heart. The men were now pounding on his front door. He gave the closet one last look before walking to the entrance. His hand paused on the doorknob, the image of the girls' terrified faces flashing in his mind. Whatever secrets lay on the other side, he knew with absolute certainty that his life would never be the same after he opened that door. The wind's howl had ended, but a different kind of storm was just beginning. Ethan turned the knob, ready to face whatever fate awaited him. In their hiding spot, the twins clutched each other's hands, their hearts pounding in a frantic rhythm of hope and fear. The door swung open to the frigid dawn, and with it, a new chapter began to unfold on Ethan's old farm, a story of secrets, redemption, and the unexpected power of children to mend a broken heart. In the silent ascent of his private elevator, Richard Harding straightened the knot of his silk tie. The reflection that stared back was the one he presented to the world, a hard, unyielding gaze that unnerved his board members and captivated Wall Street. The sleek chronograph on his wrist read 7:45 p.m., another quarter successfully conquered at Harding Corporation. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He usually ignored calls after hours, but the name on the screen made him scowl. Ashley, the twins' nanny. "Mr. Harding?" Ashley's voice was trembling. "The girls, they're—" "Be direct, Ashley. You know I don't have time for drama. They're gone." The elevator chimed, arriving at his penthouse, but Richard didn't move. "What do you mean, gone?" "I only went to the bathroom for a few minutes. When I came back, the back door was open, and—" Ashley dissolved into sobs. A surge of pure annoyance washed over Richard. "Stop crying and tell me exactly what happened." As Ashley stammered out the story between sobs, Richard stared out at the city below. Thousands of lights glittered, each one a life he could influence, buy, or break with a single decision. Yet now, for the first time in a long, long time, Richard Harding felt a tremor of powerlessness. "Have you called the police?" he asked, his voice a controlled monotone that masked the turmoil inside. Yes, sir. They're on their way. Don't leave. I'm coming." Richard ended the call and finally stepped into his penthouse. The thousands of square feet of minimalist luxury had never felt so vast and empty. On one wall, a single photograph disrupted the stark contemporary design. The twins on their 5th birthday 3 months prior. Lily and Grace smiled for the camera in matching party dresses. Richard had barely made it that day, caught up in an urgent video conference with Chinese investors. "Damn," he muttered, snatching his Porsche keys. On his way back to the elevator, he passed the girls' room, a perfectly curated space he seldom entered. 20 minutes later, he screeched to a halt in front of his mansion in the suburbs. 3 police cruisers were already parked in the sweeping driveway, their flashing red and blue lights painting the night in frantic strokes. Ashley waited at the door, her face a mess of tear-streaked makeup. "Mr. Harding, I'm so sorry." Richard brushed past her, striding into the living room where a group of officers had gathered. Mr. Harding, a detective, approached him. "I'm Detective Reynolds. We need to ask some questions." "I don't have time for that. I want a search team mobilized immediately." "Sir, I understand your concern," Reynolds began, "but we need to establish—" "No, you don't understand," Richard cut him off, his voice sharp. "Do you know who I am? What I can do? I want helicopters, tracking dogs, every available officer out there looking for my daughters." The detective faltered, clearly intimidated. "Mr. Harding, we'll follow standard procedures." Richard pulled out his phone. "Fine, I'll call the mayor then. I'm sure he'll have a different opinion about standard procedures." 15 minutes later, the night was torn apart by sirens as multiple cruisers fanned out from the mansion. In the sky, 2 helicopters began circling, their powerful searchlights sweeping over the area. Richard watched it all from his home office window, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. The last time he'd felt this kind of fear was— No. He refused to think about her now. "Mr. Harding," Ashley knocked timidly at the door. "The police want to know if you'd like to join the search." Richard took a sip of whiskey, the burn a welcome distraction. "What for? I have people paid to do that." Ashley hesitated. "But, sir, they're your daughters." "Exactly, and the sooner they're found, the sooner I can get back to business." His voice was so cold it surprised even him. When Ashley left, Richard let his mask of indifference fall. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled open a desk drawer, revealing an old photograph, a younger, happier version of himself with a blonde-haired woman holding 2 newborn babies. "You'd know what to do, Emma," he murmured to the photo. "You always did." The ringing of his phone shattered the vulnerable moment. It was his assistant, reminding him of a board meeting early the next morning. "Cancel everything," Richard ordered, the words startling him, "and get my private jet ready. I want to be prepared to fly at any moment, if it becomes necessary." Hanging up, he turned back to the window. The helicopter beams danced across the dark forest bordering his property. Somewhere out there, his daughters, the only 2 people left who could breach his defenses, were lost. And for the first time in his relentlessly successful life, Richard Harding felt the crushing weight of his own limitations. Downstairs, detectives were questioning Ashley about the girls' routines, their friends, anything that could offer a clue. Have they mentioned anything different lately? Any change in behavior? Ashley twisted her hands in her apron. They've been talking about their mother a lot. Detective Reynolds looked up from his notepad. Their mother? Yes, Mrs. Harding. She left 2 years ago. The girls were very young, but lately they've been asking a lot of questions. Reynolds made a few notes. And how does Mr. Harding handle that? Ashley glanced nervously toward the stairs. He doesn't. He changes the subject, works even later. The girls learned not to mention their mother around him. The detective nodded, scribbling a few more lines. A profile was taking shape in his mind. An absent father, children starved for attention, and a missing mother whose memory was beginning to stir their curiosity. Upstairs, Richard continued his silent vigil. The whiskey in his glass was warm now, forgotten. His eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. The hours crawled by. Reports trickled in, all negative. No sign of the girls in the northern sector, nothing at the local park, no leads from the shopping center. At midnight, Detective Reynolds came upstairs to deliver another grim update. Mr. Harding, he began cautiously. Maybe if you could give us more information about Mrs. Harding. No. The word was a blade in the quiet room. Sir, with all due respect, if there's a possibility the girls tried. Richard turned, his eyes flashing with a cold fire. Emma is dead. End of discussion. Reynolds took an involuntary step back, taken aback by the sheer intensity of the reaction. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know. Now you do. Anything else? No, sir. We'll continue searching. When the detective had gone, Richard loosened his tie, a suffocating feeling closing in on him. The mention of Emma always did this. It was easier to hide in spreadsheets and acquisitions, safer to build an empire than to confront his own pain. But now, alone in his office, while his daughters were lost to the night, Richard Harding began to question every choice he had ever made. The sharp ring of his phone snapped him from his reverie. An unknown number. Harding. Mr. Harding, a rough, tired voice said, about the search for your daughters. Richard gripped the phone tighter. Did you find anything? Not exactly, sir, but we found small footprints near the northern part of the forest, close to some abandoned farms. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Another vague clue, another uncertain direction. Keep searching, he commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Deploy more teams to that area. I want every inch of that forest combed before sunrise. Ending the call, his gaze returned to the darkness beyond the window. Somewhere out there, his daughters, the only ones who could still pierce his armor, were lost. And for the first time in his life, Richard Harding felt utterly powerless. His eyes fell once again on the photo in his drawer. Emma, the babies, his last true family. He slammed the drawer shut, stood, and straightened his tie. Reynolds, he called out, his command voice returning, gather a team. I'm going to the northern area personally. The detective looked surprised. Are you sure, sir? We can continue coordinating from here. No more coordinating from afar. Richard cut him off. My daughters are out there. Dawn was approaching, painting the sky in shades of bruised pink. Somewhere in the receding shadows, 2 little girls were waiting to be found, and a father was finally beginning to understand that all the money in the world couldn't buy back lost time with the ones you love. Dawn brought a new kind of silence to the old farm. Ethan awoke to the sound of childish giggling from the kitchen, a sound so foreign in his solitary home that he momentarily thought he was dreaming. Lily, you can't use that much flour. But I want to make big pancakes, Grace. Ethan found his kitchen in a state of controlled chaos. Flour dusted the countertops like a fresh layer of snow, and the twins, still in their pajamas, were attempting to create something that vaguely resembled pancakes. What do you two think you're doing?" His voice came out sharper than he'd meant, and the girls froze, identical expressions of guilt on their flour-smudged faces. "We wanted to make you breakfast," Lily explained, clutching a wooden spoon like a scepter. "To say thank you." "Yeah," Grace chimed in. "Dad always says debts have to be repaid." Ethan felt that familiar squeeze in his chest. "Your dad says that, does he?" "Yes," Lily nodded emphatically. "He says business is business, and he does a lot of business," Sarah added, "like a whole lot." Ethan started to clean up the mess, observing how the girls worked in perfect unspoken sync to help him. "What kind of business?" "All kinds," Lily answered evasively. "He has a huge office, way up high, where you can see the whole city." Ethan frowned. A wealthy businessman with a high-rise office. Why would his daughters be running from a life of such privilege? "Breakfast is almost ready," Grace announced proudly, presenting him with a lopsided but perfectly golden pancake. Ethan couldn't suppress a small smile. Not bad for a first try. The girl's eyes lit up at the praise. It was unnerving how a single gruff word of approval could make them blossom. After breakfast, the twins insisted on exploring the farm. Ethan followed them reluctantly, seeing his own decaying property through their curious eyes. To them, every discovery was an adventure, every derelict corner a new kingdom. "Look, Lily, a swing?" The old tire swing still hung from the ancient oak in the yard, its rope frayed by years of weather. Ethan's heart stuttered. Sophie had loved that swing. "Better not," he started, but Lily was already helping Grace onto the tire. "Higher," Grace squealed with delight as her sister pushed. Ethan watched, his body tensed, ready to intervene at the slightest hint of danger. But the sound of their laughter was infectious, echoing through the yard like a long-forgotten melody. "Your turn, Mr. Ethan," Lily called. "No, Please," they both begged in unison. He found himself giving in, his large, calloused hands gently pushing the swing as the twins took turns. The sound of their joy seemed to push back the long shadows that had haunted this place for years. The morning sped by. The girls rediscovered the old, empty chicken coop. "We could have real chickens here," Lily suggested, her eyes shining. "And a garden there." Grace pointed to a weed-choked patch that had once been a flower bed, with colorful flowers. Ethan watched them making plans, his heart torn between the fear of attachment and the unwelcome joy their presence sparked. After a lunch of makeshift sandwiches from the last of his supplies, the twins insisted on helping with chores. "Dad says everything has to be organized," Lily declared, meticulously folding an old blanket. "Yeah, he doesn't like mess," Grace agreed, though her idea of organizing was to shove things under the couch. "Your dad sounds interesting," Ethan commented, probing for more information. The twins exchanged their familiar, secretive look before Lily replied, "He's very busy, always in important meetings." "More important than you," Ethan couldn't stop the question from escaping. The heavy silence that followed was all the answer he needed. In the afternoon, while the girls drew with some old pencils and paper they found in a drawer, Ethan found himself noticing their differences, despite their identical appearances. Lily was the protector, the watchful one, always looking out for her sister. Grace was the dreamer, often lost in a world of her own stories and fantasies. "What are you drawing?" he asked Grace. "Our family," she answered simply. "Look, this is you." Ethan's heart clenched at the sight of the childish drawing. Him, the twins, and a figure with wings. "Who's that?" "Our mom," Lily said softly. "Grace always draws her like an angel now." Ethan swallowed hard. "And where is your mother?" "In heaven," Grace replied, still focused on her drawing. "Dad doesn't like to talk about her, but we miss her." "Is that why you ran away?" Lily let it slip, her hand immediately flying to her mouth. Ethan sat down heavily in his armchair. "You ran away from home." The twins seemed to shrink. "We didn't want to," Lily explained, "but Dad is never there, and Ashley is mean." "And who's Ashley?" "Our nanny," Grace answered. "She doesn't let us talk about Mom." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, his own raw memories of loss echoing in the girl's words. When he opened them, two pairs of identical eyes were watching him with concern. "Did you lose someone too?" Lily asked gently. Ethan nodded, surprised by his own honesty. "My wife and daughter. In an accident." Grace stood up and, before Ethan could react, wrapped her small arms around his neck. Lily quickly joined in. "You're not alone anymore," Grace declared with the simple conviction of a child. Ethan felt the sting of tears he had refused to shed for years. The girl's embrace felt like a balm on wounds he thought were permanent. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity. The twins decided the house needed renovating, which mostly involved rearranging furniture and creating art from found objects. To his own astonishment, Ethan joined in. He helped them clean dusty windows, fix a wobbly chair leg, and even unearthed some old gardening tools from the barn. "Tomorrow we can start the garden," Grace planned excitedly over a dinner of vegetable soup Ethan had improvised from the dregs of his pantry. "And fix the chicken coop," Lily added, "and paint the fence." Ethan knew he should stop them, explain that they weren't staying, that this was all temporary. But the words wouldn't come. After dinner, as the girls got ready for bed, Ethan heard the distant wail of sirens. His heart hammered. The police search for missing children. "Mr. Ethan," Grace's voice called him back, "could you tell a story?" "I don't know many stories." "Then tell us about your daughter," Lily suggested, already snuggled into bed beside her sister. Ethan hesitated. It had been so long since he'd spoken Sophie's name aloud. She loved that swing," he began, his voice thick. "She'd spend hours on it, asking to go higher." The twins listened, rapt, as Ethan, for the first time in years, shared memories of his family. It felt as if each word spoken aloud lifted a small piece of the crushing weight from his soul. When the girls finally fell asleep, Ethan remained for a long time, watching them breathe peacefully. In a single day, they had brought more life into his house than he'd thought possible. The sirens still whined in the distance. He knew he had to do the right thing, call the police, return them to their family. But the thought of his home returning to its suffocating silence was almost unbearable. In the room that had once held only ghosts, there was now a flicker of hope. Grace still clutched her drawing, the makeshift family they had become in just 24 hours. Ethan gently picked it up, studying the childish lines. There he was, drawn with a smile he hadn't worn in a lifetime. The twins, hand in hand. And the winged figure, not just their mother, he realized, but all mothers, all lost loves, still watching over their children. The sound of an engine on the road made him tense. Soon the search would reach these remote parts. Soon he would have to face reality. But for now, in this moment suspended between the fading day and the dawn that would bring a reckoning, Ethan allowed himself to feel something he'd long forgotten: hope. The twins stirred, instinctively seeking each other's warmth. Ethan pulled the blanket over them, his gentle touch betraying the affection he was fighting so hard to deny. "Good night, little ones," he whispered, his voice heavy with an emotion he couldn't name. As he left the room, he paused for one last look. In a single day, they had started to melt the ice around his heart, bringing color back to a world that had long been only shades of gray. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, but tonight Ethan allowed himself to dream of blooming gardens, of chickens in the coop, and of the sound of children's laughter echoing through the halls of his once silent home. The sirens were a constant, distant reminder that this dream, like all dreams, would have to end. Yet, for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to wake up. It was the twins' 5th day on the farm. Ethan watched from the kitchen window as they played in the yard, which they had begun to tidy. Their laughter was a foreign sound on a property that, for the first time in years, was starting to feel less like a graveyard and more like a home. Grace swung happily on the mended tire swing, while Lily watered the seeds they had planted the day before in what they called their magic garden. Ethan allowed himself a small, private smile. The old radio in the kitchen crackled with local news, more out of habit than any real interest, as he prepared lunch with supplies he'd bought in town, his first trip to the market in weeks. The search intensifies for the Harding twins. The name slammed into him. Ethan turned up the volume. Lily and Grace Harding, daughters of billionaire Richard Harding, CEO of Harding Corporation, have been missing for 5 days. The reward offered by the family has already surpassed. The plate in Ethan's hand slipped and shattered on the floor. Harding, the name that had haunted his nightmares for years, the man who had orchestrated the ruin of everything he held dear. As if in a trance, Ethan stumbled into the living room and flicked on the small television. Richard Harding's face filled the screen, the same cold, calculating face he'd seen in countless business articles, the same gaze that had condemned dozens of small-time farmers like him to foreclosure. And next to the billionaire's photo were 2 smiling, familiar faces in expensive school uniforms, Lily and Grace. "No," Ethan mumbled, sinking into his armchair. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. 5 years ago. "Mr. Miller, be reasonable." Harding Corporation's lawyer adjusted his sleek glasses. "Our offer is more than generous." Ethan stared at the papers on his kitchen table, the same table where the daughters of his nemesis now ate breakfast. "This farm has been in my family for 3 generations," he'd replied, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "It's not for sale." "Then we'll have to be less friendly," the lawyer had smirked. "You must understand that progress is inevitable. Harding Corporation is revolutionizing agriculture in this region. Small producers like you, well, you either adapt or get crushed," Ethan finished bitterly. The lawyer had shrugged. "Business is business, Mr. Miller. Business is business." The exact words the twins had echoed, parroting their father. In the months that followed, Ethan watched helplessly as Harding Corporation squeezed him from all sides. The price of supplies mysteriously skyrocketed. His regular buyers began canceling their contracts. Suddenly, the bank was questioning his solvency. "You can't fight them, Ethan," his neighbor Hank had warned, loading the last of his family's possessions onto an old pickup. "Harding is like a steamroller. He flattens everything in his path." But Ethan fought. He mortgaged what was left, worked himself to the bone, tried to innovate. And then came the accident. Sophie was just 5, the same age as the twins. It was a sunny Sunday, and she had begged to go to town with Elizabeth to buy seeds for her own little garden. Ethan never found out for sure if the Harding Corporation truck had really lost its brakes, or if he couldn't go down that road. But the timing was too cruel. The day after the funeral, the pressure to sell his land had mysteriously vanished. "Dad?" Grace's voice snapped him back to the present. The twins were standing in the doorway, looking at him with worried eyes. "Are you crying?" Lily observed quietly. Ethan touched his cheek, surprised to find it wet. On the TV, Richard Harding continued his dramatic plea for his daughter's return. "Please," the billionaire's voice cracked, "whoever is with my girls, they're all I have left." "Liar!" Ethan spat, shutting off the TV with a vicious stab of the button. The twins flinched at his tone. "Mr. Ethan," Grace asked timidly, "did we do something wrong?" Ethan's heart fractured at the fear in their eyes. No, they were blameless, innocent children, just as Sophie had been. But they were his daughters. The blood of the man who had destroyed Ethan's life ran in their veins. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice raw. The girls exchanged a nervous glance. "Tell you what? About your father. About who you really are." Lily stepped forward, her small body a protective shield as always. "You seem different." "Are you going to send us away?" Grace asked, tears already welling. Ethan stood abruptly, needing space. His hands were shaking. Revenge. The word was a seductive whisper in his mind. Richard Harding was finally vulnerable. Through his precious daughters, Ethan could make him feel a fraction of the agony he had endured. "Mr. Ethan," Lily called, her small voice trembling, "please don't be mad at us." "Yeah, we promise to be better," Grace pleaded desperately. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut as more memories assaulted him. 4 years ago, the farm in its prime, fields of corn waving in the breeze, Elizabeth in her garden, Sophie running through the flowers, the barn freshly painted, hope hanging in the air. 3 years ago, the arrival of the first Harding Corporation tractors, giant machines devouring neighboring properties, the sound of fences being torn down, of dreams being bulldozed. 2 years ago, sleepless nights over ledgers filled with red ink, Elizabeth crying silently in the kitchen, Sophie asking why they couldn't have ice cream on Sundays anymore. 1 year ago, the funeral, 2 caskets, one large, one impossibly small, the rain mingling with his tears, and in the distance, the Harding Corp logo on the wrecked truck, a final mark of scorn on his grief. "We can leave," Lily's voice brought him back, "if you want us to." Ethan opened his eyes. The twins were huddled together, silent tears tracking paths through the grime on their faces. Grace clutched her drawing of their makeshift family. "But we don't want to," Grace sobbed. "We want to stay with you." "You remind us of Mom," Lily explained softly. "She liked gardens too and telling stories and she also got sad sometimes," Grace finished. "But not like Dad. He just gets angry." Ethan felt his heart twist. How many layers of pain were tangled in this family story? How much hurt was passed down from parent to child in a never-ending cycle? "Mom said we should be kind," Lily continued, "even if people aren't kind to us. Because sometimes," Grace sniffled, "people are mean because they're hurt." The simple, innocent wisdom of a child struck him like a bolt of lightning. Ethan staggered back to his armchair, feeling the immense weight of his choice. He could use these girls. He could make Richard Harding suffer. But what kind of man would that make him? What kind of man would Sophie have wanted him to be? "Come here," he called, his voice thick. The twins hesitated for a moment before running to him. He pulled them into a hug, feeling their tears soak into his flannel shirt. "I'm sorry I scared you," he murmured. "Do you still like us?" Grace asked in a small voice. "Even if we're his daughters," Lily added. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the decision settle in his soul. On the muted TV, Richard Harding's image still flickered, the man who had destroyed his life, now begging for the return of the same daughters who were, unknowingly, slowly rebuilding Ethan's broken heart. "Yes," he replied at last, "I still like you." It was true, he realized with a jolt of surprise. Despite everything, despite the name they carried, he had come to care for these 2 lost little girls. The question now was what to do with this unexpected, inconvenient love. The police sirens sounded closer now. Eventually, they would expand their search to his property. Eventually, he would have to choose revenge or redemption. The twins snuggled deeper, trusting him completely. Ethan looked out the window at the garden they had started, at the seeds of hope planted in soil that had long been barren. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery hues. Somewhere, Richard Harding was leveraging his fortune and influence to find his daughters. And here, on a rundown farm, Ethan Miller held those very daughters in his arms, fighting the urge for vengeance that threatened to consume his newly thawed heart. Tomorrow, he would have to decide. But for now, he allowed himself this moment of peace, listening to the girls' breathing even out as the day died. The radio still crackled in the kitchen, announcing astronomical rewards, but Ethan barely heard it. In his mind, other voices echoed. Sophie's laughter, Elizabeth's humming, and Lily and Grace, bringing life back to his empty house. And somewhere beyond all the hatred and pain, a softer voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was another path. Night fell hard over the farm, bringing with it the weight of a decision that could no longer be deferred. Ethan sat in his armchair long after the twins had fallen asleep, the distant sirens a constant mournful chorus blending with the ghosts of his past. Sophie's photo still smiled at him from the mantel, her face forever 5 years old, the same age as Lily and Grace. Beside her, Elizabeth held a bouquet of daisies from her garden, her smile the one that had always been able to melt his stubbornness. "What would you do?" he whispered to the photographs. "How do I choose between justice and revenge?" The house offered only silence in return. Upstairs he could hear the soft, even breathing of the twins, who had refused to sleep until he promised he'd still be there in the morning. "You won't disappear, right?" Grace had asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Like Mom?" "Everybody always disappears," Lily had added, her voice trying for bravery but trembling at the edges. Ethan rose, his heavy steps carrying him to the kitchen. Moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the drawing Grace had made, now stuck to the refrigerator with an old magnet. Their makeshift family. It would be so easy to keep it this way, to pretend the outside world didn't exist, that it could just be the three of them in this small haven they had built. The girls were already making plans to paint the barn, get real chickens, and plant more flowers. But with every passing hour, the sirens crept closer. Sooner or later, someone would connect the dots, the missing twins, the reclusive farmer, the isolated property. And then the phone rang, the sound so jarring it made Ethan jump. Who would be calling at this hour? Ethan, it was Hank, his old neighbor, his voice tight with worry. "You need to know, people are talking in town, about kids at your farm." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What?" "Pete at the market. He mentioned you bought groceries a kid might eat." "And Mrs.? Johnson swears she heard children's laughter coming from your place when she drove by." "Hank, Listen." Hank's voice dropped to a tense whisper. "There are cops everywhere, and Richard Harding himself is around, offering a reward. If you know anything." Ethan closed his eyes. "Thanks for the warning, Hank. Ethan, whatever you're thinking of doing, remember Sophie. Think about what she would want." The mention of his daughter was a fresh stab of pain. He hung up, his hands shaking. Sophie, his little Sophie, who cried over injured birds and insisted on sharing her cookies with less fortunate kids at school. What kind of example would he be setting for her memory by using two innocent girls as pawns in a game of revenge? He moved silently up the stairs, pausing at the guest room door. Lily and Grace slept tangled together, as always. Grace clutched a raggedy stuffed bunny they'd found in the attic, one of Sophie's old toys that Ethan had never had the heart to throw away. The moonlight bathed them in a silvery glow. In that moment, he saw it with a clarity he had been denying. They weren't extensions of Richard Harding. They weren't tools. They were just two scared children who needed love and safety, just as Sophie had, just as all children do. "Damn," Ethan muttered, running a hand over his face as the tears he'd dammed up for so long finally broke free. The decision he had been dreading solidified in his heart. It wasn't a choice, not really. It was the only path he could take and still be a man his family would have recognized. Returning to his room, he picked up the phone. His fingers trembled as he dialed the number he'd memorized from the news reports. "Hello?" a tired voice answered. "Detective Reynolds." "Yes, who is this?" Ethan took a deep, shuddering breath. "My name is Ethan Miller, and I know where the Harding twins are." The silence on the other end was absolute. "Then, Mr. Miller, are you saying—" "They're here, on my farm. They're safe. I've taken good care of them. And I'll give you the address." "Do not move," Reynolds ordered, his voice suddenly sharp and fully awake. "We're tracing your call. Units will be dispatched immediately. Mr. Harding will be notified." "Wait," Ethan interrupted. Can I ask one thing?" "What?" "Give me until dawn." "To prepare the girls? They're attached to me." I need to explain. A tense pause. We have your location, Mr. Miller. If you try anything... I'm not running, Ethan promised. Just give me these last hours with them. Another silence. Until dawn, Reynolds finally conceded. Not a minute more. Ethan hung up, feeling as if he had just signed his own death warrant. But it was the right thing to do. It was what Sophie would have wanted. The hours that followed were the longest of his life. He spent them sitting in the guest room armchair, watching the twins sleep, memorizing the way Grace's nose wrinkled in a dream, how Lily's arm was protectively draped over her sister, even in rest. As the first pale rays of dawn painted the sky, he gently woke them. "Mr. Ethan," Grace mumbled sleepily. "Is it breakfast time already?" "Girls," he began, his voice heavy, "we need to talk." Lily sat bolt upright, her eyes instantly searching his face. "What's wrong?" "Your father knows you're here," he admitted. "And it's not going to be easy, but you have to be strong now." The twins sat up, their small faces grave as Ethan explained. He told them about the phone call, about the police coming, about how they had to go home. "But this is our home now," Grace protested, tears already streaming down her face. "We don't want to leave." "You promised," Lily accused, her voice full of hurt. "You promised you wouldn't send us away." "I'm not sending you," Ethan tried to explain, his own heart breaking. "But you have a father, a life." "A father who's never there," Lily shouted, her voice cracking, "who doesn't even look at us. And you do. You make hot chocolate and tell stories and let us help in the garden," Grace sobbed. "Like Mom used to," Lily finished. Ethan pulled them into a fierce hug, feeling his own tears fall into their blonde hair. "Sometimes," he said gently, "doing the right thing hurts a lot. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it." "We don't want to do the right thing," Grace mumbled into his chest. "We just want to stay with you." The sound of engines grew louder. "My little warriors," Ethan said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "Come on, get dressed. You're strong, remember? You're my garden warriors." The girls nodded miserably, tears still falling as they changed. Ethan helped them pack the few treasures they'd gathered, their drawings, the stuffed bunny, the seeds they'd set aside to plant. "Can we at least finish planting the daisies?" Lily asked in a small voice. "Before we go?" Ethan glanced out the window. Police cars were now visible on the road to his farm. "There's no time, sweetheart." Grace clung to his legs. "Promise you won't forget us." "Never," Ethan vowed, kneeling to their level. "You brought light back to this old house. How could I forget that?" The sirens were deafening now. Ethan led the girls into the living room, his heart a leaden weight. "Mr. Ethan," Lily asked, taking his hand, "you're a good person, like Mom used to say. Sometimes good people look sad on the outside, but they have lots of love inside." "Yeah," Grace agreed, taking his other hand. "We miss you." Before he could answer, headlights flooded the room. Cars screeched to a halt outside, doors slammed, and authoritative voices shouted commands. "Police, come out with your hands up." Ethan knelt one last time before the twins. "Remember, you're strong, and you are loved, no matter what happens." "Ethan Miller," Detective Reynolds' voice boomed through a megaphone. "We know you're in there. Release the children immediately." "It's time," Ethan said softly. The twins clung to him, as if their love alone could hold back the tide. He opened the front door, keeping the girls shielded behind him. The dawn light revealed a surreal scene. Police cruisers, officers with weapons drawn, and at the center of it all, a figure Ethan would recognize anywhere. Richard Harding. "Daddy!" Grace cried out, running forward before Ethan could stop her. "Grace, wait!" Lily followed her. Ethan watched, his heart clenching, as Richard Harding fell to his knees to embrace his daughters. For a brief moment, the powerful businessman's mask shattered, revealing only a father clutching his lost children. "My girls," Richard murmured, tears visible on his usually impassive face. I thought I'd lost you too." "Like Mom?" Grace asked with innocent cruelty. Richard pulled them closer. "Never again. I promise." Ethan started to retreat back into the house, but Lily's voice stopped him. "Wait! Mr. Ethan!" She ran back, wrapping her arms around his legs one last time. Grace quickly joined her. "Thank you," Lily whispered, "for everything." Richard Harding watched the scene, a complex, unreadable expression on his face. He slowly approached, his daughter's hands in his. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice softer than Ethan had ever heard it. "You don't need to say anything," Ethan interrupted. "Just take good care of them." "He took good care of us," Grace told her father. "He made hot chocolate and fixed the swing and let us plant flowers." "Just like Mom used to," Lily chimed in. Something shifted in Richard's gaze, perhaps a flicker of dawning comprehension. He studied Ethan with new eyes, seeing past the disheveled farmer he had once sought to crush. "My daughters seem to have found a friend in you," he said slowly. Ethan just shrugged, uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "Are they special?" "They certainly are," Richard agreed, a genuine smile momentarily softening his features. "And apparently they have good judgment of character." Detective Reynolds stepped forward, handcuffs at the ready. "Mr. Miller, you're under arrest for—" "No," Grace yelled. "He didn't do anything wrong." "It's true," Lily defended him. "We ran away. He just took care of us." Richard held up a hand, silencing Reynolds. "Detective, I think we can handle this differently." He turned to Ethan. "Mr. Miller, could we talk? About your farm. About everything." Ethan blinked, stunned. Was this an olive branch? "Daddy," Grace tugged on Richard's expensive coat. "Can we visit Mr. Ethan sometimes, please?" "Yeah," Lily begged. "You have to see the garden when the flowers bloom." Richard looked from his daughters to Ethan, to the farm he had once viewed as a mere asset to be acquired. Now he saw something else entirely, a place of healing, a sanctuary where his children had found comfort. "Perhaps," he said softly, "we can all learn something here." The handcuffs were removed from Ethan's wrists. The sun was fully risen now, illuminating the small, newly tilled garden where tiny green sprouts of hope were beginning to push through the soil. Lily and Grace ran to it, calling for both men to come see the seeds they had planted together. And there, in the golden light of a new morning, old wounds began to mend. Ethan watched the girls proudly show their father each patch of dirt, explaining their plans for the chicken coop, the dreams they had built in a few short, magical days. "Look, a daisy," Grace announced excitedly, "just like the ones Mom used to grow." "And sunflowers over there," Emily added. Mr. Ethan said they always turned toward the sun, like people searching for hope. Richard Harding adjusted his tie, visibly moved. His eyes roamed the simple garden, then met Ethan's. "Mr. Miller," he began, clearing his throat, "it appears I owe you more than just thanks. You not only protected my daughters, you helped them connect with the memory of their mother." Ethan looked away, uneasy. "They're good kids. They just needed someone who had time to listen." The comment landed. Richard winced slightly, watching his daughters, more vibrant than he'd seen them in years. "Maybe," he said slowly, "it's time to make some changes. With the company? With my life?" He paused. With this region?" Ethan looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there might be room for different forms of agriculture, tradition, and progress side by side." Richard extended his hand. "If you're willing to talk about it." Ethan stared at the hand, the same one that had signed the death warrant for so many farms like his. But it was also the hand of a father who was, perhaps, finally beginning to understand true value. "Daddy," Grace yelled from the garden, "come look at the little buds that are popping up." Mr. Ethan, too. The two men exchanged a look. Years of bitterness versus a few days of innocence. A dark past against a possible future. Ethan finally took the offered hand. "For the garden," he said simply. "For the garden," Richard agreed, a real smile touching his face. "And for the gardeners." The twins cheered, running to hug both of them. And there, in the reborn garden of a farm that had nearly died, old wounds slowly began to heal. Detective Reynolds watched from a distance, signaling for his units to quietly withdraw. This was no longer a crime scene. It was the start of something else. "Mr. Ethan," Grace tugged on his sleeve, "will you visit us in the city and teach us more about gardens?" "And tell us stories," Lily added hopefully. Ethan looked at Richard, who nodded. "It would be an honor to have your expertise, Mr. Miller. My daughters and I have a lot to learn." A warmth spread through Ethan's chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Like the seeds in his garden, it would need time and care to grow. "How about we start with those daisies?" he suggested, making the twins grin. And so, as the sun climbed higher, 4 people scarred by loss began to build something new among the flower beds and reborn dreams. It wasn't a happy ending. It was something better, a new beginning. Sophie and Elizabeth, Ethan thought, would be proud. Somewhere, Emma was smiling too. And in the garden of the old farm, life continued its eternal cycle of endings and beginnings, of pain and healing, of revenge transformed into redemption by the pure, stubborn love of 2 little gardeners. A week had passed. The farm, once defined by its silence, now echoed with children's laughter on the weekends when Lily and Grace came to visit their Mr. Ethan and tend to the garden they had started together. This Saturday morning, however, held a different kind of tension. Richard Harding had requested a private meeting, and now the 2 men sat in the farm's dusty office, coffee growing cold between them. "Mr. Miller," Richard began, his tone controlled as he reviewed a file, "our legal department found something unsettling." Ethan watched as the businessman opened an Italian leather briefcase and produced a yellowed folder. His heart seized when he saw Elizabeth's delicate handwriting on the cover. "What's this?" he asked, his voice rough. "Property sale documents," Richard replied calmly. "Signed by Elizabeth Miller, your wife." The world seemed to tilt. Impossible. Elizabeth never... "She sold 30% of the farm's land to Harding Corporation," Richard continued, spreading the documents on the table. "Secretly, about 6 months before the accident." Ethan took the papers, his hands trembling. There it was, Elizabeth's unmistakable signature, dates, amounts, a substantial transaction he knew nothing about. "Why?" he murmured, more to himself than to Richard. A memory, sharp and painful, flashed in his mind. 6 months before the accident. "Ethan," Elizabeth had called from the barn doorway, "we need to talk about the farm." "Not now, honey," he'd answered, his head deep in the tractor's engine. "I have to finish this before harvest." "It's important," she insisted. "It's about the future." "The future is right here," he'd grunted, patting the tractor. "As long as we keep everything running." Elizabeth had hesitated, biting her lip, a telltale sign of her worry. "What if we need to consider other options?" "There are no other options," he'd said firmly. "This land has been in my family for generations. You know that?" Elizabeth had nodded slowly, a shadow crossing her face. "Yes, I do." Back in the present, Ethan stared at the documents. "She received quite a sum," Richard commented quietly, "well above market value." "Money," Ethan laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Elizabeth never cared about money. She loved this land as much as I did. Maybe," Richard conceded, "she loved something even more." Another flashback gripped him. 5 months before the accident. "Sophie has a fever again," Elizabeth had said, her voice strained as she prepared dinner. "It'll pass," he'd replied, buried in the farm's finances, the numbers a sea of red. The doctor suggested some tests, she'd ventured. "Tests? Elizabeth, we barely have money for next season's seeds." "What if it's serious?" she'd asked, her voice trembling. "What if our daughter needs..." She's strong, he'd cut in. Like all the Millers. She'd be fine. Tiny footsteps interrupted them. Sophie, pale and thin, dragging her stuffed rabbit. "Mommy," she'd called. "My head hurts." Back to the present, Ethan's hands shook more violently. "The money," he said slowly, the horrific truth dawning on him, "never showed up in our account." "Because Elizabeth opened a separate account," Richard nodded. "For medical tests," Ethan finished, agonizing memories snapping into place. "Sophie was sicker than I wanted to admit." The sound of laughter drifted in from outside. Lily and Grace playing under Ashley's watch. He rose and walked to the window to see them. "She tried to tell me," he murmured. "So many times. 4 months before the accident." Elizabeth had found him in the barn late one night. "We need to be practical. The farm is draining all our money, and Sophie, the farm is our legacy." He had exploded. "It's Sophie's future." "What future?" she'd asked softly, "if she's not healthy enough to enjoy it." He turned back to Richard, who was watching him with a complex expression. "Why show me this now?" "Because," Richard replied, "we also found this." He slid a yellowed envelope across the table. Ethan recognized it instantly. Elizabeth's special stationery with tiny flowers on the edges, sealed with the purple wax she saved for special occasions. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal. "My dear Ethan, if you're reading this, something went wrong. I intended to tell you everything face to face, to explain my choices, to beg for your forgiveness. But time is running out, and Sophie needs us more than ever. Forgive me for selling part of the land without your knowledge. I know it seems like an unforgivable betrayal, but a mother does what she must to save her child. The doctors found something in the latest exams, something that needs immediate treatment. The money from the sale is in a special account, all documented with this letter. I know you'll hate me for this, see it as a weakness or as giving up. But sometimes, my love, we have to lose something in order to save something even more precious. Sophie needs specialized care. The farm can wait. Our love can overcome this. Forgive me for making this decision alone. Forgive me for—" The letter ended abruptly. "The accident happened the next day," Richard said gently. "They were on their way to the Mayo Clinic for the tests," Ethan replied, his voice breaking. "The specialist in Rochester—" "Mr. Ethan," Grace's voice interrupted, a small fist knocking on the office door. "Look! The first daisy bloomed. You have to see. It's just like the pictures of your wife in her garden," Lily added. Ethan and Richard exchanged a look before opening the door. The twins burst in, carefully carrying a single white daisy. "Isn't it beautiful?" Grace asked, holding it up. "The most beautiful," Ethan agreed, his voice choked. Lily, ever perceptive, saw his tears. "Mr. Ethan, are you sad?" "Sometimes," he answered gently. "We feel sad when we remember the people we love very much." "Like when we miss Mom?" Grace asked innocently. "Yes," Ethan smiled sadly. "Exactly like that." Richard watched, his own eyes misty. "Girls," he said softly, "how about we show Mr. Ethan that surprise we brought?" The twins brightened. "Yes, come on, Mr. Ethan." They led him outside to a van, where Ashley opened the back doors to reveal dozens of flower seedlings. "They're all for your garden," Lily announced proudly. "Dad helped pick them," Grace added. "He said gardens need a lot of love to grow." Ethan looked at Richard, who had followed them out. "I thought," the businessman said quietly, "it might be time for some new beginnings." "Mr. Ethan," Lily tugged on his sleeve. "We also brought this." She held out an envelope. Inside were old photos of Elizabeth and Sophie in the garden, smiling, pictures Ethan had locked away, unable to bear looking at them. "We found them in Mom's album," Grace explained. "She kept pictures of gardens, too." "Emma always admired small farms," Richard said softly. "She used to say they were the heart of the land." Ethan held the photos, gazing at Elizabeth's smile. "She tried to save us," he murmured. Save Sophie. Save everything." "And now," Lily asked, taking his hand, "are you still angry with her?" Ethan knelt down, the tears flowing freely at last. "No," he answered honestly. "Now I understand." Grace impulsively hugged him. "When I'm sad," she said, "hugs help." Lily joined in. "And gardens too." Richard cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller?" "Ethan. Maybe we can honor their memories in a different way." Ethan looked up. "How?" "Harding Corporation has resources, expertise. Your farm has soul, history." Richard paused. "Maybe it's time for a real partnership, not a hostile takeover like I once planned, but genuine collaboration." The twins cheered. "We can help," Grace exclaimed. "Yes, in the experimental garden," Lily added. Ethan stood slowly, looking at the farm he loved, the flowers beginning to sprout, the two girls who had thawed his frozen heart, and the man he had blamed for his misery, now offering redemption. Elizabeth had tried to save them. Now, through a twist of fate, two other little girls had completed her mission. "A partnership," he repeated, extending his hand to Richard. The businessman took it firmly. "For the future and for the garden." The twins shouted in unison. Ethan smiled through his tears, a massive weight lifting from his shoulders. Somewhere, he knew, Elizabeth was smiling too. They were all running to unload the new seedlings, Ashley following with a gentle smile. "They really are special," Richard remarked, watching his daughters. "Just like Emma was. They see beauty where others only see business." "Like Elizabeth," Ethan agreed quietly. She always knew what truly mattered. The two men walked toward the garden, where the twins were already hard at work, their laughter echoing like music. In his pocket, Ethan still clutched Elizabeth's unfinished letter, but it was no longer a source of pain, but of gratitude for her love, her courage. "Mr. Ethan," Grace called, "come see where we're going to plant the sunflowers." They always turned toward the sun, Lily explained to her father, like people looking for hope. Ethan and Richard shared a knowing smile. Sometimes children have to teach us the most profound truths. And there, in the reborn garden, old wounds finally began to heal, watered by the pure love of two little gardeners who had, unknowingly, completed the mission Elizabeth had begun so long ago. Dawn had barely broken when Ethan started rummaging through the farmhouse attic. Elizabeth's unfinished letter had awakened something in him, a desperate need to understand, to find the missing pieces of the puzzle surrounding his loss. Dusty boxes revealed fragments of his previous life. Wedding photos, Sophie's school notebooks, old receipts carefully organized by Elizabeth's meticulous hand. Each object held a memory, each memory another layer of understanding. "Mr. Ethan," Lily's voice surprised him. He hadn't realized the twins had already arrived with Richard for their weekend visit. "Up here," he replied, his voice rough from dust and suppressed emotion. Tiny footsteps climbed the attic stairs. Lily and Grace appeared in the doorway, eyes wide at the organized chaos Ethan had created. "What are all these things?" Grace asked, picking up a framed photo. "Memories," Ethan answered softly, "of people I loved very much." "Is that your wife?" Emily pointed to Elizabeth in a wedding photo. She was so pretty. "She was," Ethan smiled sadly, inside and out. "Like our mom," Grace said, settling near a box. "Dad says people who are beautiful on the inside never really die." Ethan felt his heart squeeze. "Your dad said that?" "He cries sometimes," Lily confided in a low voice, "when he thinks we don't see." The sound of heavier footsteps on the stairs signaled Richard's arrival. He stood in the attic entrance, looking out of place among the dusty relics of a simpler life. "I figured I'd find you here," he said, "after everything we uncovered yesterday." "Look," Grace interrupted, holding up a small book. "A diary." Ethan took the leather-bound notebook, its cover worn, pages yellowed. Elizabeth's diary. With trembling hands, he opened it to the last entry, May 15th. I've stored the sale documents in the false bottom of the old dresser. The money is safe in the special account, all documented for Ethan to find. I know he'll hate me at first, but once he understands why. Sophie got worse today. The fever won't go down. The specialist at the Mayo Clinic is our last hope. Ethan is a good man, but sometimes his love for the land blinds him to other forms of love. I hope he can one day understand that selling part of the farm wasn't giving up. It was fighting a different way. Tomorrow we're going to the hospital. After that, I'll tell him everything, praying he can forgive. The entry ended there. The day of the accident. The old dresser, Ethan murmured. It's still in the master bedroom. Do you want me to? Richard finished. But Ethan was already heading downstairs with the twins and Richard close behind. The master bedroom, closed since Elizabeth's death, still held the faint scent of her lavender perfume. The antique dresser dominated one wall, a beautiful piece once belonging to Elizabeth's grandmother. With skilled hands, Ethan began to examine the back, looking for here. He found the tiny hidden lever. The false bottom opened with a soft click. Inside was a folder of documents, more paperwork from the sale, bank statements, and a savings passbook. Another sealed envelope lay there. For Ethan, when you find the money. This time the letter was complete. My love, if you're reading this, it means you found the sale papers and the money. It also means I'm probably not here to explain in person. All the funds are in the special account, $850,000 total. I know it seems like a betrayal to sell part of our land without your knowledge, but Sophie needs us more than ever. The doctors found something in her latest exams, something that requires immediate specialized treatment in Rochester. Dr. Matthews is the best pediatric neurologist in the country. I know you'd say we can figure something else out, that the land is our legacy, but what kind of legacy do we have if we lose our daughter? I only sold the farthest section of the property, the one we can barely maintain anyway. Harding Corporation offered a fair deal, well above market. Richard Harding can be many things, but he knows business, and more importantly, he understands loss. He lost his wife to the same condition threatening our Sophie now. Yes, my love, Emma Harding died from a brain tumor 2 years ago, the same type doctors suspect in our little one. That's why I chose his company. That's why I trusted him to understand the urgency, the need to act quickly and discreetly. The money is waiting. The doctors are ready. I only need you to understand and forgive me. Sometimes we must let go of something we love to save something we love even more. With all my love, Elizabeth. P.S. If something goes wrong, if I'm not here to explain it in person, know that every decision I made was for love. Love for you, love for Sophie, love for the life we built together. Ethan let the letter drop, his legs giving out. Richard steadied him before he collapsed, guiding him to the bed. Did you know? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Richard nodded slowly. About Emma, yes? It was awful, watching her fade away. The twins were so small, that's why the above-market price. Elizabeth contacted me directly, Richard explained. She showed Sophie's medical records, explained the situation. As she said, I understood the urgency. The twins, unusually quiet, moved closer to Ethan. Sometimes, Lily said wisely, people do things that look wrong for very right reasons. Like when we ran away, Grace added. It seemed wrong, but it brought us to you, Lily finished. Ethan embraced the girls, letting the tears finally flow freely. She was trying to save our daughter, he murmured, and I was so blind. It's not too late, Richard said softly. When Ethan looked confused, he continued, to honor her plan, to save the farm. How? A real partnership, Richard explained, sitting beside him on the bed. Not the hostile takeover I once envisioned, but true collaboration. Your know-how, my resources. We can turn this place into a model of sustainable agriculture. The twins clapped their hands excitedly. "And we can help," Grace exclaimed. "Yes, in the experimental garden," Lily chimed in. Ethan looked around the room, at Elizabeth's belongings, at the photos on the walls, at these two girls who had brought light back to his life, at the man he once considered an enemy, now offering a chance at redemption. "Elizabeth wanted to save everything," he said slowly. "Sophie, the farm, our family." "She still can," Richard replied, "through a different legacy." In the days that followed, the news spread through the community. Elizabeth's story, her courage, her sacrifice, her vision, touched hearts and changed perspectives. Hank, the old neighbor, was the first to show up with tools, offering to help restore the barn. Others followed, local farmers bringing seeds, knowledge, solidarity. Harding Corporation, now under Richard's new direction, began adopting more sustainable practices. Ethan's farm became a test site for hybrid techniques, combining the best of traditional farming with modern technology. The twins came every weekend, filling the property with their laughter and ideas. The experimental garden thrived under their enthusiastic care, a living symbol of renewal and hope. "Look, Mr. Ethan," Grace called one Sunday afternoon. "The daisies we planted are huge, bigger than the ones in the city garden." "That's because we followed Elizabeth's sketch from her diary," Lily added proudly. Ethan watched the girls race among the flowers, Richard at his side on the porch. "There are a bridge, aren't they?" Ethan commented. "Between the past and the future. Between us?" Richard smiled, watching his daughters. "Just as our wives would have wanted." In his shirt pocket, Ethan carried Elizabeth's letters, no longer a burden of guilt, but a reminder of love and sacrifice. The pain was still there, and probably always would be, but now there was also understanding, forgiveness, and above all, hope. "Mr. Ethan," Lily called, "come quick. There's a bird's nest in the apple tree, and the eggs are about to hatch." "And there are 3 of them," Grace added excitedly. Ethan and Richard exchanged a look before joining the girls. Life, like the seasons on the farm, continued in its eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Somewhere, Ethan knew, Elizabeth and Emma were smiling, their choices, their sacrifices, their love, finally understood and honored through their children and this new partnership born of shared pain. The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. The twins were still running around the garden, their laughter echoing like music through the property. Richard typed notes into his tablet, planning the next round of improvements. And Ethan, standing among the flower beds, finally felt at peace. The money from the sale, still untouched in the special account, would be used as Elizabeth had planned. Not to save Sophie, who was already beyond saving, but to preserve her legacy in another way. The Miller-Harding Ranch, as the new signs proclaimed, would become a center for agricultural research and education, a place where tradition and progress could coexist, where children like Lily and Grace could learn about the land, about growth, about love in all its forms. "Mr. Ethan," Grace tugged on his sleeve, "tell us that story again, about your wife and the magic garden." Ethan smiled, sitting down on the bench he and Richard had built together the previous weekend. Once upon a time, he began as the twins settled beside him. There was a woman who believed love was like a garden. Sometimes we have to prune a few parts so others can flourish. Richard joined them, listening to the story he already knew by heart. And there, under the evening sky, 4 hearts scarred by loss continued their own process of blooming, nurtured by the love Elizabeth had planted so long ago. The Miller-Harding Ranch shone under the spring sun, unrecognizable from a year ago. Where once stood broken fences and abandoned fields, now wildflowers swayed in the breeze between rows of crops arranged in precise geometric patterns, traditional and modern farming living in harmony. Ethan observed the bustle from the restored porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. A group of college students followed Hank, his former neighbor and now educational manager, learning about sustainable farming techniques. In the experimental fields, Harding Corporation specialists tested new seed varieties developed for small producers. "Mr. Ethan! Mr. Ethan!" The familiar sound of the twins' voices made him smile even before he saw them. Lily and Grace came running up the stone path they had helped build themselves, their golden braids bouncing in the wind. "Guess what?" Grace exclaimed, bounding onto the porch. "We won first place at the science fair." "With our project about the experimental garden," Lily finished, brandishing a golden trophy. Ethan set his cup down and opened his arms for the double hug. "My little scientists, I knew you'd do it." The teacher said she'd never seen such a complete project, Lily said proudly. "Yeah, we explained everything about sustainable agriculture and how to combine old methods with new technology," Grace elaborated, exactly like the Miller-Harding Ranch. A deep voice added from the bottom of the steps, "I came earlier today." Richard Harding climbed the porch, carrying a mysterious box. His expensive Italian suit now seemed perfectly at home in this rural setting, as did his smile, more frequent and genuine these past months. "Of course I did," Richard smiled. "I couldn't miss today's ceremony." Ethan felt his heart beat a little faster. The ceremony. After a year of transformations, the moment he both dreaded and looked forward to had arrived. "I brought something special," Richard continued, placing the box on the porch table. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, old pictures of the farm in its glory days, when the Miller family first settled there. More recent photos, too, showing Elizabeth in her garden, Sophie on the swing, moments captured from a life that seemed so distant now. "How?" Ethan began, his voice thick with emotion. "Elizabeth sent copies of all the important photos along with the sale documents," Richard explained gently. "She wanted to make sure the farm's history was preserved, even if everything changed." Ethan ran a finger over one photo in particular. Elizabeth and Sophie planting daisies, identical smiles beaming under the summer sun. "Look," Lily pointed at one of the pictures. "The garden looked just like the one we made." "That's because we followed Elizabeth's sketch," Grace said. "Remember the one we found in her diary?" Ethan smiled through the tears that threatened to fall. Elizabeth's diary had become a sacred guide for the twins, who insisted on recreating every detail of the original garden. "It's almost time," Richard reminded gently. "People are already arriving." Indeed, cars began parking at the farm's entrance. The entire community had gathered for this day, the official opening of the Miller-Harding Agricultural Research and Education Center, and the dedication of the Elizabeth Miller Memorial Garden. "Come on, Mr. Ethan." Grace tugged his hand. "We need to get ready." "Yeah, we have a special surprise," Lily added, with a mysterious grin. An hour later, the farm was bustling with activity. Hundreds of people gathered in the large field behind the house. A small stage had been set up near the memorial garden. Ethan climbed the steps on shaky legs, Richard beside him for support. The twins, dressed in matching floral dresses, waited on stage with radiant smiles. "Good afternoon, everyone," Richard began at the microphone. A year ago, this farm was a symbol of conflict between tradition and progress. Today, it represents something else, the possibility of unity, understanding, and shared growth. He paused, looking at Ethan with respect. But this transformation didn't start with us. It began years ago with a woman who had the courage to see beyond divisions. She understood that sometimes we have to lose something to gain something greater. Ethan stepped forward, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Elizabeth Miller was more than my wife. She was a visionary. She saw what I couldn't, that a farm is not just about land and crops, but about connections, learning, and life in all its forms." The twins stepped forward, each gripping one side of a covered plaque. And now, Lily announced into the microphone, "Our surprise." With a dramatic flourish, they pulled away the fabric, revealing a beautifully crafted bronze plaque. "Elizabeth Miller Memorial Garden, where love and land meet, flowers always bloom." Below the plaque, a delicate mosaic depicted Elizabeth and Sophie in their garden, recreated from Ethan's favorite photo. "We drew it," Grace explained proudly. "And the city artists helped make it," Lily added. Ethan touched the mosaic with trembling fingers, feeling as though Elizabeth were there, smiling through the artwork. "This garden," he said into the microphone, "will be more than a memorial. It will be a living lab where children learn about the land, where researchers develop sustainable farming methods, where families can reconnect with nature and each other." Richard took the microphone again. "The Miller Harding Ranch is proud to announce that starting today, we will offer annual scholarships for young farmers. The Elizabeth Miller Fund will support those who, like her, dream of a future where tradition and innovation walk hand in hand." The twins ran to hug Ethan when he stepped away from the mic, letting his tears flow openly at last. "Don't cry, Mr. Ethan," Grace comforted him. "Elizabeth's happy. Look how many flowers bloomed today." It was true. The memorial garden was bursting with color, as if nature itself was celebrating. The ceremony continued, but Ethan barely heard, lost in his own reflections. A year ago, he had been a broken man, consumed by bitterness. "Mr. Ethan," Lily nudged him gently. "It's time to plant the special tree," the final part of the ceremony. In the center of the memorial garden, a space had been prepared. The twins led Ethan there, where a young apple sapling waited. Because Sophie loved apples, Grace explained to the crowd. "And because trees are like families," Lily added, "they grow strong when they have good roots." Ethan, Richard, and the twins worked together to plant the tree, a symbolic moment of unity. When the last shovel of dirt was placed, the sun was starting to set, bathing the garden in golden light. The crowd began to disperse, but the four remained, contemplating their work. "You know what would be nice," Grace asked dreamily, "if we lived closer?" "Yeah," Emily agreed excitedly. "We could come here every day, not just on weekends." Richard and Ethan exchanged a surprised look. "Well," Richard cleared his throat, "it just so happens that the big house at the farm's entrance is for sale. Hank's old place." "It would be convenient," Richard continued, "to oversee the projects more closely." The twins started jumping for joy. "Please, Daddy, please!" "Mr. Ethan?" Ethan glanced around at the flourishing garden, the revitalized farm, the two girls who had changed his life, and the man who had gone from enemy to friend. "You know," he said slowly, "Elizabeth always said, gardens grow better with more people to tend them." Richard smiled, extending his hand. "Partners?" "Family," Ethan corrected, taking the offered hand. The twins cheered, running to hug both men. And there, in the garden Elizabeth had envisioned, under the young apple tree destined to grow strong and fruitful, four hearts wounded by loss continued to heal, united by a love that transcended time, tragedy, and misunderstandings. The sun finally set, but no one moved. The first stars began to appear, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of flowers. "Look," Grace pointed at a firefly dancing among the flowers. Soon others joined, creating a glowing dance in the twilight garden. "It looks like magic," Lily whispered. "It is magic," Ethan replied softly. "The magic of love, healing, and new beginnings." Richard placed an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "And of the families we find in the most unexpected places." The twins smiled, their faces lit by the golden glow of sunset and the promise of a new dawn. Somewhere, Ethan knew, Elizabeth was smiling too. Her final gift had finally bloomed into something more beautiful than she could have imagined. The Miller Harding Ranch was no longer just a rural property. It was a living testament that love, like the seeds Elizabeth had loved to plant, can grow in even the most unlikely soil, turning pain into beauty and loss into a new beginning. The future stretched ahead like a springtime garden, full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long, long while, Ethan couldn't wait to see what each new day would bring.